What happens when the most feared man in New Orleans discovers that his 5-year-old daughter, the one who has screamed, scratched, and bitten through 7 caregivers in 4 months, won't let go of the one woman nobody in his world would ever look at twice? Imani Webb was not what anyone would call an obvious choice. She was 26 years old, 5'3", and 270 pounds of quiet desperation wrapped in a second-hand blazer. She'd ironed that morning on the floor of her studio apartment. Because her ironing board had collapsed 2 weeks ago, and she hadn't had the money to replace it. She had a community college certificate in early childhood development, 3 years of experience at a daycare center that had closed without warning, and a grand total of $42 and some loose change in her checking account. She was not glamorous. She was not connected. She was not the kind of woman whose name floated around the marble halls of Audubon Place. But she was the only one who answered the listing. The agency had posted it quietly: a private client, residential care, immediate start, compensation described only as significantly above market rate. 6 other candidates had withdrawn before their interviews. 2 had shown up, taken one look at the address and the men standing outside the gate, and gotten back in their cars. A 3rd had made it through the front door before she bolted. Imani didn't know any of that when she stepped off the streetcar on St. Charles Avenue and started walking. She knew she needed rent. She knew she needed it by Friday, and she knew that $42 was not going to get her there. Her landlord, Mr. Tourode, had been patient for 8 months. His patience had officially run out via a notice taped to her door on Monday. Below the notice, someone had slipped a handwritten note from Darius Monk, a man who ran numbers out of a laundromat on Magazine Street, and who Imani had been foolish enough to borrow from 6 months ago when her mother's dialysis costs had wiped her out. The note said simply, "This week, Imani, I'm not asking again." She had read both pieces of paper standing in her doorway in her socks, the hallway smelting like someone's reheated crawfish, and thought, okay, something has to break. Then she'd gone inside, ironed her blazer on the floor, and applied for every listing she could find. This was the only callback she got. The address on her phone led her to a stretch of Audubon Place she'd passed 100 times on the streetcar without ever setting foot on. The houses here were not houses. They were the kind of structures that made you understand, viscerally, what it meant to belong to a different world entirely. Iron fences, old oaks draped in Spanish moss, gravel driveways so long you couldn't see where they ended. She found the gate. 2 men in dark linen shirts, too well-tailored to be casual, too intimidating to pretend otherwise, were standing beside a small guardhouse. One of them was speaking quietly into an earpiece. The other looked at Imani the way people sometimes looked at her, a slow, assessing sweep that landed on her wide hips and her thick arms and stayed there a half-second too long before moving to her face. "Imani Webb," she said, before he could say anything dismissive. "The agency sent me." There was a pause. The man with the earpiece murmured something. The gate opened. She walked up a driveway lined with old camellias, her worn flats crunching on gravel, sweat already collecting at the back of her neck in the thick Louisiana humidity. The house at the end was antebellum in architecture, wide galleries, tall white columns. The kind of place that had a history she probably didn't want to think about too carefully. But she kept walking because $42 and Darius Monk's note and her mother's next dialysis appointment were all very real. A man with a close-shaved head and a jaw like a cinder block opened the front door before she knocked. He didn't introduce himself. He said, "Living room," and turned, and she followed him through a foyer with a chandelier and floors, so polished she could see her own reflection blurred beneath her feet. She was left in a room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace that probably hadn't been used in years, and a French door opening onto a garden. She stood in the center of the Persian rug and breathed slowly through her nose and told herself not to wipe her palms on her blazer. Then Théodore Arcand walked in. She'd seen powerful men before, in the abstract. Politicians on television, executives quoted in business sections. She skimmed at the library. She had never been in the same room as one. Théodore Arcand was 41 years old, built with the kind of unhurried solidity that comes from decades of certainty. His hair was black going silver at the sides. His face was sharp-planed and serious, with dark eyes that moved across the room and settled on her with the immediate, uncomfortable precision of a man who made his living reading people and deciding, in under 10 seconds, what they were worth. He wore a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and said nothing for a moment. "Miss Webb." "Yes, sir." He clasped his hands behind his back and walked a slow semicircle, not around her exactly, but the way a man does when he's thinking. "You have experience with children under 5, 3 years at Magnolia Early Learning Center before it closed. Before that, I helped raise my 4 younger siblings. The agency tells me you have a certificate in early childhood development." From Delgado. His gaze moved over her again. That same assessing look the man at the gate had given her, but different, less contemptuous, more calculating, which was somehow both better and worse. "The position requires someone with physical endurance. My daughter is 5 years old. She does not walk. She runs. She climbs. She has, in the past month, pulled a bookcase onto herself, dislocated a nanny's finger during a tantrum, and escaped through a second-floor window using a knotted bedsheet." Imani blinked. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement. Something that had the shape of it briefly. To the garden wall, the guards retrieved her. She bit one of them. "What's her name?" He paused as though the question surprised him. "Céleste. How long ago did her mother pass?" The pause this time was longer. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "So she was 4. Imani nodded slowly, mostly to herself. "And before that, was she like this? The running, the climbing, the escaping?" "No." His voice was flat. "She was not." Imani looked at the French doors, at the garden beyond them, sunlight coming through oak leaves and dappling the stone pathway. "Mr. Arcand," she said, and she kept her voice level because she was 26 years old and 270 pounds, and she had survived a lot of rooms where people had already decided she didn't belong. "I understand the previous caregivers weren't able to stay. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't give me pause. But I'd like to meet her, if that's all right, before either of us decides anything." He studied her for a long moment. "She's in the East Garden. Can I go out?" He gestured toward the French doors. Imani walked through them. The garden was shaded and overgrown in places, the kind of controlled wildness that happened when a space had been beautiful and tended, and then, for a while, nobody had the heart for it anymore. In the far corner, near a wrought iron bench, a little girl was sitting on the ground in a white eyelet dress that was already ruined at the knees. She had black curls, her father's sharp cheekbones, and the expression of someone who had decided the world was entirely untrustworthy and was waiting to be proven right. She looked up when Imani came through the door. She didn't run. She didn't yell. She watched. Imani didn't go to her. She walked to the bench nearby, lowered herself onto it. It creaked under her weight, and she let it creak, didn't apologize for it, and looked at the garden instead of at the child. After a long moment, "Are those black-eyed Susans?" Silence. "My grandmama had them in her yard in Shreveport. She said they were weeds, but she never pulled them out. Said any flower brave enough to grow without being invited deserves to stay." More silence. Then, very quietly, "Weeds don't have names. Sure they do. People just don't bother learning them." Imani looked sideways, slowly, like she wasn't really doing it. The girl was watching her now with the cautious, measuring attention of a much older person. "Black-eyed Susans are Rudbeckia hirta, the wild ones, anyway." The girl's nose rinsed. "Most of the good ones are." Céleste pushed herself up from the ground without any apparent plan and stood there with dirt on her dress. and her hair half escaped from what had been a braid. She took 3 steps toward Imani and stopped. Her dark eyes went to Imani's hands, wide and dark and resting open on her own knees, then back up to her face. "You're not scared of me," Céleste said. "It was not a question, not particularly," Imani said. "Should I be?" The girl considered this with great seriousness. Then she crossed the remaining distance, climbed up onto the bench beside Imani with the boneless ease of a 5-year-old, and pressed her entire small body against Imani's side. She tucked her head against Imani's arm like she was settling into a chair she had always known was there. Imani stayed perfectly still. She didn't grab her, didn't fuss, didn't make a sound. From the doorway, Théodore Arcand watched. His enforcer, a compact and permanently expressionless man named Roux, appeared at his shoulder. They stood without speaking for a moment. Then Théodore said, "Offer her whatever she's asking. She hasn't named a number yet." "Whatever she asks," he repeated quietly, "and then triple it." Life inside the Arcand house rearranged itself around Imani the way water rearranges around a stone dropped into it. Not all at once, but inevitably. Céleste was difficult. That had not been overstated. She had tantrums that turned the East Wing into a disaster zone, threw things with remarkable accuracy, and twice in the first week locked herself in the bathroom and refused to come out for 2 hours. But Imani had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment with 4 younger siblings and a mother working double shifts, which meant she had learned very early that a screaming child and a ruined afternoon were not emergencies. They were just Tuesday. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She didn't bribe with sugar or screens, which had been the previous nanny's primary strategy and which had the consistency of a Ponzi scheme. It worked until it didn't, and then it collapsed spectacularly. Instead, Imani sat on the floor outside the bathroom door when Céleste locked herself in and told stories. Not children's stories, real ones, about her grandmother's garden in Shreveport, about the time her brother Dantrell had gotten stuck up a tree and been too proud to yell for help for 3 hours, about the summer she was 11, and found a bird with a broken wing behind the dumpster of their apartment complex and kept it in a shoebox under her bed until it healed and flew away, and how she'd cried for an hour after because she hadn't realized until that moment that she'd wanted it to stay. By the end of the first week, Céleste had stopped locking doors. By the second week, she had started following Imani into the kitchen in the mornings, dragging a step stool to the counter to watch her make biscuits. The kitchen was Imani's peace. She baked the way other people prayed, with the focus of someone who needed something to go exactly right. She made biscuits and cornbread and pralines on Sunday afternoons, and once, for no particular reason, an entire king cake that she set on the counter and watched Céleste decimate with her bare hands. The guards started lingering near the kitchen door around 8 in the morning. Roux appeared one morning with a coffee mug and stood in the doorway watching her roll dough. He said nothing for several minutes. "You could just ask," Imani said without looking up. "Asking is not typically part of my job description," Roux said. She cut him a biscuit and set it on the counter without fanfare, and after a pause he took it and ate it standing in the doorway, and she thought she heard him make a sound that in another man might have been a small moan of relief. "The big guy at the front gate," she said. "Tremblay. He takes his coffee black." Roux paused. "How did you know his name?" I asked him. She looked up. "You should try it sometime." Roux looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing something quietly. Then he left with his biscuit. Théodore Arcand came and went like weather, present and overwhelming and then absent, and the house changed temperature both times. He left before dawn most mornings and returned after dark. Occasionally he didn't return at all, and Roux would be in the hallway in the morning with dark eyes and a terse. "Mr. Arcand is out of town." Imani didn't ask questions she didn't need answered, but some evenings he came home and stood in the doorway of whatever room she and Céleste were in and watched them. He never announced himself. She'd just look up and he'd be there, jacket off, shirt open at the collar. The particular exhaustion of a man who carried things he couldn't put down visible in the set of his shoulders. Céleste would look up from whatever she was doing, register her father's presence, and then, Imani noticed this, quietly, in her chest, look back at Imani first, like checking that she was still there. He had noticed it too, she could tell. One evening late, she was in the kitchen finishing a batch of pralines when she heard him come in. The house was quiet. Céleste had been asleep for 2 hours. Imani was standing at the stove in her robe, the thick terrycloth one from the room she'd been given, the most comfortable thing she had ever worn in her life, stirring the sugar and cream in a slow, meditative circle. "You should be asleep," he said from the doorway. "So should you," she said, and then caught herself. "Sorry, I didn't mean." "No." He came into the kitchen, which felt different from him simply being in a room. He took up more space when he was tired, or maybe she just noticed it more. He poured himself 2 fingers of something amber from a bottle on the counter and leaned against the opposite side of the island. "You're right." She kept stirring. He sipped his drink. The kitchen was warm and smelled like brown sugar and butter. "She slept through the night again," Imani said. Something moved in his face. "The whole night. 3rd night in a row." He looked at the glass in his hands. The praline mixture was reaching temperature, and she moved quickly, pulling it from the heat and dropping spoonfuls onto parchment. Her hands were fast and confident. When she looked up, he was watching them. "She used to bake with her mother," he said quietly, like he was telling it to the counter instead of to Imani. "I figured. She knew where everything was the first day I was in here, knew which drawer the spatulas were in." He nodded slowly. Inez was in this kitchen every Sunday. The name fell into the room with weight. Imani let it settle without filling the space around it, which was something she'd learned. Grief needs room to just sit without someone immediately handing it a meaning. "Céleste asked me today if I was going to leave," Imani said. His eyes came up. "I told her I wasn't planning on it." Imani set down the last praline and looked at him straight, the way she'd learned to look at people who were used to others looking slightly to the side. "But I don't make promises to children I'm not sure I can keep." "What would make you sure?" he asked. His voice was careful. It had a different quality to it than his day voice, less authority, more something else. More human, maybe. "Job security, I suppose." She picked up a praline and placed it on the counter in front of him. "I've been evicted once. I've borrowed money from people I shouldn't have. I've got a mother on dialysis whose insurance has a gap every 3rd month. I'm not in a position where I can afford loyalty that isn't returned." He looked at the praline for a moment. Then he looked at her. Then he ate the praline. "Your salary is being adjusted," he said. "Effective this week. Rue will bring you the paperwork in the morning." "Okay," she said. "And he paused. "Send me the information for her provider." Imani stared at him. "Arcand, you are in my house," he said with the return of some of that authority, but it had something underneath it now that she hadn't heard before. "Céleste has slept through the night 3 nights in a row. Whatever you need to stay, tell Rue." She nodded once. He nodded back. He took his glass and left the kitchen. She stood there in her terrycloth robe, for a moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then she cleaned up the kitchen and went to bed and looked at the ceiling of her room, a room 4 times the size of her entire studio apartment, and told herself firmly that she was an employee, that this was a job, that the way he had looked at the praline and then at her, the quality of the silence in that kitchen at 11:30 at night, was none of her business. She almost believed it. 6 weeks in, the past arrived the way it always does, without warning, through a door she thought she'd closed. She'd been given Tuesday afternoons to herself. Théodore, she had started thinking of him by his first name, privately, which she recognized was a symptom, was home early that Tuesday, and he had taken Céleste into the garden to teach her to identify the birds in the old oak tree. Imani had slipped out the back gate with a pass from Rue and walked the 12 blocks to the hospital, where her mother had her standing appointment. Her mother, Doris, was a small woman who had made herself very large in Imani's life through sheer force of personality. She sat in her dialysis chair, with her feet crossed at the ankles and her reading glasses on, a library paperback open in her lap, and looked up at Imani the way she always did, with a complex mixture of love and concern that she'd never quite learned to separate. "You look rested," her mother said, which for Doris was practically a declaration of joy. "I sleep in a real bed now," Imani said. "It's a game changer. You look like something else too." Her mother's reading glasses came off. "You want to tell me about it?" "No." "Then sit down and tell me about the little girl." So she did, told her about Céleste, about the garden and the black-eyed Susans and the biscuits and the stepstool and the night terrors that had slowly begun to quiet. Doris listened the way she always did, with her whole attention, and her eyes did something complicated more than once. "This child lost her mama," Doris said, 14 months ago, and her daddy doesn't know how to be soft." Imani opened her mouth and closed it. "He's trying." "I didn't say he wasn't." Her mother looked at her. "I said he doesn't know how. There's a difference." A pause. "And you're helping him. I work for him." Doris said, which was her full vocabulary when she thought someone was being deliberately obtuse. Imani walked home the long way, through the garden district, which she loved for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate. Something about the light through old oak canopies and the way the houses had histories written into their bones. She was 3 blocks from the Arcand gate when a car pulled up alongside her. She recognized it, or rather, she recognized the man who rolled down the window, Darius Monk, 38 years old, soft in the face, hard in the eyes, with a gold ring on every finger and the patient malice of a man who had never once lost a debt he was owed. "Imani," he said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. Her stomach went cold. "Darius, you've been hard to reach. I've been working. I know exactly where you've been working." He tilted his head. His driver watched the rearview mirror. "Théodore Arcand's house. That's interesting, Imani. That's very interesting. I'm a nanny," she said. "I take care of his daughter. You also live in that house." He smiled slowly. "You're inside those walls every night. You know the layout. You know the guard schedules, the gate codes. You know where the man sleeps." He leaned his arm on the window frame. "I've got some people who'd find that information very useful. In exchange, your debt disappears. Clean. We're done." Imani felt her throat tighten. "I'm not doing that. The debt has been growing, sweetheart. You're not in a position to say no." "There's a child in that house," Imani said, and her voice didn't shake, but it cost her. "She is 5 years old and she just started sleeping through the night. I am not." "Friday," Darius said. "There's a bar on Choop, Kelsey's. You know it. Be there by 10 with something useful, or I start having conversations with people who are very interested in the access you have." He looked at her for a long moment. "Don't be stupid about this, Imani. You were always smarter than that." The window went up. The car pulled away. She stood on the sidewalk in the thick evening heat and breathed until she stopped shaking. Then she walked back. She told herself she was going to pack her bag, that she would pack her bag and leave a note for Rue and be gone before morning, because leaving was the only way to keep Céleste safe, that this was the rational decision, the only decision. She got back to the house and went to Céleste's room to check on her, as she always did, and found the girl awake, sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest, wide, dark eyes, finding Imani immediately in the doorway. "You came back," Céleste said. The simplicity of it hit Imani somewhere she wasn't prepared for. "I said I would. Everyone says that." The girl was quiet for a moment. "Imani, will you stay until I fall asleep?" She sat on the edge of the bed. Céleste immediately folded herself against her side, curling into the soft warmth of her and Imani pulled the blanket up and rested her chin gently on the top of those dark curls. She did not pack her bag that night, but for 3 days she moved through the house like a woman already gone, quietful, careful somewhere else behind her eyes. She held Céleste through every meal and story and bath time, and felt something splinter in her chest that she couldn't name. Théodore noticed. Of course he noticed. He appeared in the doorway of the nursery on Thursday night, where Imani was sitting in the armchair by Céleste's crib. Céleste had been asleep for an hour, and Imani hadn't moved, which was the tell, because she was never still without purpose. He came in and closed the door quietly behind him. He crossed the room and crouched in front of the armchair, putting himself at her eye level, which was not a thing a man like him did easily or by accident. He looked at her in the low light. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. Her hands, folded in her lap, had a slight tremor. "Imani," he said quietly. "Just her name." She looked at him. Her eyes were dry, but only just. "Tell me," he said. The way he said it. Not what's wrong, or is everything okay, but just tell me. Like he already knew something had happened, and the only question was whether she would trust him with it. That was what broke her. She told him. All of it. Darius Monk, the loan, her mother's bills, the car on the sidewalk on Tuesday evening, the Friday deadline, what she'd been asked to deliver. She told him in a steady, quiet voice and watched his face, and his face did something she hadn't expected. It didn't harden into judgment. It went very still, and behind his eyes something came alive that was cold and precise and absolute. "I was going to leave," she said. "I thought it was the safest thing." "You were going to leave without telling me." His voice was neutral, but only on the surface. "I didn't want Céleste to be used because of me, Imani." He reached out and took her hands in his, her wide, dark hands, both of them in his larger, scarred ones, and held them with a steadiness that surprised her. "Look at me." She did. "You are not leaving," he said, and Darius Monk made a significant miscalculation tonight by putting his hands on something that is mine to protect. She felt her pulse in her throat. "I'm your employee. You are under my roof." His eyes held hers. "That means something in my world. You are safe here. Céleste is safe here. Nothing that man threatened is going to touch either of you." A pause. "Go to sleep, Imani. I'll need you present tomorrow." Céleste has decided she wants to identify every bird in the city by Saturday. Something between a laugh and a sob moved through her chest. She pressed her lips together to contain it. He squeezed her hands once and stood. At the door, he looked back. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." Friday came with thunderstorms, the kind that New Orleans does in August, sudden, overwhelming, turning the streets into rivers within 20 minutes. Inside the Arcand house, everything was calm. Inside Kelsey's bar on Chupitulas, at 10:15, Darius Monk sat at a corner table, waiting with a patience made entirely of certainty. He'd done this 100 times. People with debts always showed. The door opened. Not Imani. Rue walked in. Behind him, 2 men Darius didn't recognize. They were dressed plainly, moving without hurry, and that unhurried quality was the thing that made the back of Darius's neck go cold. Théodore Arcand came through the door last. He was in a dark jacket, his silver-touched hair damp from the rain. He looked like a man who had come to have a quiet drink at the bar and happened to see someone he knew. He pulled out the chair across from Darius and sat down. "Darius Monk," he said, "you've been collecting debts in my neighborhood for 12 years, and I've never had cause to concern myself with you." He set his hands on the table, flat and still. That changed Tuesday. Darius's gold rings clicked together where his hands gripped the edge of the table. "Romano, Arcand, listen, whatever she told you, she told me everything." Théodore's voice hadn't changed in quality. It was the same low, precise tone he used to discuss board meetings or Céleste's breakfast. "You approached a woman under my protection and made a threat. You involved her in something that endangered my daughter, and you called in a debt that, as of this morning, no longer exists. I've settled it. In full, with enough interest that the transaction is final. Darius stared. The debt is done, Théodore said, and you are done in this part of the city. You'll find your operations in Tremé and the Marigny have become considerably more complicated as of today. If you apply the intelligence I'm told you possess, you'll recognize that this conversation is the last courtesy you'll receive from me. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. Don't let your people anywhere near my gate again. He walked out without looking back. Rouge stayed behind for 2 minutes, which were quiet enough that Darius Monk sat very still through them. And then Rouge left too, and Darius sat alone in the bar while the rain hammered the windows and thought about all the things he should have considered before he'd rolled his window down on St. Charles Avenue on Tuesday. When Théodore came home that night, Imani was awake. She was on the back gallery, sitting in a rocking chair she'd pulled from inside, wrapped in her terrycloth robe, watching the last of the storm move out over the city. The air smelled of rain and sweet olive and hot pavement, and the lights of Audubon Place glowed through the old oaks. She heard the door. She heard his steps on the gallery boards, and then he was there. Jacket folded over his arm, shirt damp at the collar, looking at her with the specific expression of a man who has just made a decision he didn't know he was going to make until he made it. "It's done," he said. She exhaled. "Rue texted me." "Of course he did." He looked out at the garden for a moment, then at her. "My mother would have liked you," he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say. She blinked. Why? She was from a small town outside Baton Rouge. She baked every Sunday morning. He paused. She said she could tell the kind of person someone was by how they moved in a kitchen, whether they were present or just going through motions. He looked at her hands, resting in her lap. "You're always present." Imani felt warmth rise in her chest and tried to hold it at a reasonable distance. "Mr. Arcand, Théodore," he said. "I think we're past Mr. Arcand." She was quiet for a moment. The city glittered. A mockingbird, she'd learned to identify it, Céleste doing, called once from the dark oak canopy. "I grew up invisible," she said finally, not sure why she was saying it, except that the night was still, and he was listening in the way he had, with his full attention. When you're a big girl from a poor neighborhood, people look right through you, or look at you, like you're taking up space that should belong to someone else. I got very good at shrinking, making myself quieter than I actually am. "You're not quiet," he said. There was something in his voice. "Not quite amusement, warmer than that. You have never once been quiet in this house. I mean it differently. I mean I got used to no one." She stopped. "Choosing you," he said. She looked at him. The word landed somewhere she hadn't meant to expose. "I don't think you understand," he said, and he moved then, crossed the few feet between them, slow and deliberate, the way he did everything, and crouched in front of her rocking chair the way he had in the nursery, putting himself at her level again. His eyes, in the low gold light from the windows, were serious and very dark and entirely focused on her. "Céleste has slept through the night. She laughs again. This house," he seemed to search for the word, "breathes again. That is you. You did that." "She did that," Imani said. "She was ready. She needed you." He reached up and, with a kind of careful gravity, tucked a strand of hair back from her face. His thumb rested against her cheek for a moment. "I needed you," he said. "I just didn't know what that looked like until you showed up at my gate in a second-hand blazer and asked my daughter about weeds." Imani's throat was tight. Not anymore." He held her gaze steadily. "I fired you approximately 30 seconds ago, which means what I'm about to say is not complicated." He leaned forward and kissed her, and it was not tentative. It was not polite. It was the kind of kiss that comes from someone who has thought about it longer than they were going to admit, and in it she tasted old grief and a future being carefully, stubbornly assembled, and something she recognized as the specific warmth of being chosen. She kissed him back. From somewhere deep in the house, the mockingbird called again, and the city of New Orleans exhaled its hot summer breath, and Imani Webb, 26 years old, 270 pounds, raised in a two-bedroom apartment on uncertainty and her grandmother's particular variety of stubborn love, let herself be chosen. Finally, with her whole chest, by someone who had not looked through her or past her but at her. From the moment she'd walked through a gate, she almost hadn't had the nerve to approach. In the weeks that followed, Théodore Arcand's men noticed something in their employer they had no prior language for, a loosening. Not of his precision or his authority, but of the particular cold that had lived in him since Ines. He laughed at dinner. He was home before dark more often than not. He was seen on 2 separate occasions rolling up his sleeves in the Arcand kitchen and letting Céleste direct him to stir things that didn't need stirring, while Imani guided them both through a recipe with the easy authority of someone who had always known this kitchen was hers. Rue told Tremblay at the gate that in 17 years of working for the Arcand family, he had never once smelled pralines in that house on a Sunday morning. Tremblay said he thought that was probably a crime. Rue said nothing, but he took the praline Imani had left on a plate by the guardhouse door, and he ate it in the morning light, and he thought that some things arrived exactly when they were supposed to, and not one moment before.